Oui, merci beaucoup pour l'invitation. I should admit that I'm not, thank you for inviting me to talk about my work. I'm actually not going to spend that much time talking about my own work. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about the work of other people, many of whom I've never even met. Because I thought maybe for this audience, a kind of a broad perspective would be appropriate, and I'm very much interested in a broad perspective on behavior. And one question to ask, I think worth asking, is what are the pieces from which behavior is constructed? What is the functional decomposition of this big problem of how the brain implements behavior? And very often, we think about it in terms of different kinds of processes, like perceptual process, like object recognition, cognitive processes like memory or decision-making, motor control processes like trajectory planning and feedback control, each of which can be characterized as a kind of a subproblem that can be then studied, so we can become specialists in a particular aspect of this. For example, I study decision-making, and less so things like smell and taste. And so these concepts, now this is, of course, this is kind of a taxonomy of concepts, and of course, very, very simplified. But I think it captures a lot of the kinds of questions that we ask. Once we have these concepts, we use them to define questions like how are memories encoded, stored, and retrieved? That might be a line of research. How does the brain make decisions? And then we try to interpret the roles of different brain structures in terms of these kinds of functions. But as many of you know, I assume, is that neurophysiological data presents some challenges to many of these concepts, where it's actually difficult to make a mapping between these things in particular brain circuits. And I'll give some examples, some of which are probably pretty well known to all of you. So one example is things that you'd think would be unified are in fact distributed. So for example, visual processing. We don't have a representation of the visual world inside our head. We'd rather have different processing streams, like the ventral system for identifying objects and the dorsal system for perceiving space. Each of these subdivides further into regions sensitive to color, motion, other regions for space near the body versus far away, etc. Raising the classic problem of binding. How does brain then take this information, which actually diverges in the brain, and construct some kind of knowledge that's needed as input for cognition and thinking? Conversely, things that we think should be distinct appear to be mixed. For example, sensory, motor, and cognitive variables are highly intermixed inside the brain. So we do have, let's say, primary sensory and primary motor regions, but in the regions in between, the so-called association regions, things are rather murky. For example, cells in these regions appear to at first encode sensory variables and then later motor representations, mixing them up with various cognitive variables in all kinds of complicated ways. And this is even true at this level of single cells. So for example, one highly studied part of the primate brain, monkey brain, is the lateral interparietal area here. And there is a long series of studies for over 30 years suggesting that this region is representing attended stimuli. So sort of the input to knowledge and cognition. But at the same time, in parallel, for that same 30 years, there have been studies suggesting that it's involved in representing intended actions. Now, intended actions about making movements like eye movements or arm movements would be the output of cognition. So how could it really be doing both of these things? And similar questions arise for other parietal and frontal regions. Is this region actually doing attention or intention? Now, also, things that one would think should be serially occur in the brain appear to be parallel. So, for example, decision making. We can find decision variables almost everywhere we've looked. In prefrontal orbitofrontal cortex, which have long been associated with higher cognitive functions, but also in parietal cortex, including area LIP. Premotor cortex, supplemental motor area, prefrontal eye fields, the basal ganglia, even primary motor cortex, and the superior colliculus that are only a few synapses away from motor output. And furthermore, we're still, the timing at which decisions emerge along all these regions is more or less simultaneous. So for simple decisions, for example, it's about 150 milliseconds after the informative cue. And in general, things are mixed. Things are difficult. One person that has summarized this very much is Michael Anderson, who's done studies of sort of meta reviews of MRI studies, looking at what he and his colleagues have called functional fingerprints, where what is the involvement of a particular region or particular network in different kinds of functions. And it's really quite distributed, as I'm sure many of you are aware. So now that raises a problem, that the classical concepts we use to explain the brain and sort of define our research programs don't seem to fit the brain so well. On one conclusion is, well, maybe we're just not looking at the data correctly. Maybe we need more of it. We need better recording or decoding methods. But another possibility is that the traditional model is just wrong. This is just not this. In fact, is not the way to subdivide brain functions. And many people have said this, of course, for many years. Patricia and Paul Churchland have said this since the 80s. Lisa Feldman Barrett, Yuri Buzaki, Russell Poldrack. Many people have said this long ago, for a long time. Motivating a search for an alternative. What could be the alternative for this breakdown of behavior? How else to think about what the brain is doing in terms of these kinds of functions? But importantly, we do need to subdivide the problem, because I don't think we can just treat behavior as some kind of single thing. There must be some way to subdivide the problem into something that's a little bit more manageable, that can define our research programs better. So many people have been looking at this, and I've been thinking about this as well. And I think one point that we can all agree on is that even though we may not know what the real functional distinctions are, we do know where they come from. They come from evolution, of course. And as Dobzhansky famously said, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. So if we agree that the brain is a product of a long sequence of evolutionary steps, then it's useful to try to ask, well, what were those steps? And the good news is there's a lot of data on that. And I'm going to summarize a lot of that. And I'm going to suggest that going through that sequence of evolution towards the human brain maybe can help us define what are the better functional distinctions that will lead us to better questions about it. So before I start, I just want to dispel some common myths. And one in particular is that the idea that evolution is nature's way of finding solutions to problems posed by the world. That's not really true, because evolution doesn't actually identify problems until really long after they're solved, right? Evolution doesn't have a task to solve. It just produces variations of a functioning ancestor. And then it just so happens that some of those variations accomplish something that used to be a problem, and at which point they survive. So it's not in any way directed towards solving problems. And also, for a variation to even enter into the game of natural selection, it must first be possible as a modification of that ancestral functioning system that doesn't screw up that system. And that is a very, very constraining limitation, which limits the variety of theories we might want to consider. And part of the reason is that the genome is not a blueprint. It doesn't describe the sort of the structure or the connectome for the brain. It's a recipe for building the brain through a developmental process. And like any recipe, different stages depend on each other. And so if you have a sequence of stages A, B, and C, you can't just arbitrarily modify an earlier stage without, even if it was advantageous, because that's going to violate the assumptions of later stages and lead to a big mess. And so evolution really is constrained to do only a couple of different kinds of things. It can elongate and elaborate the developmental process. It can differentiate and specialize systems. It can back up, abandon things, and start over again. And that really constrains the kind of systems that will appear. But so mechanisms that we see today are highly constrained by their history. In other words, they're highly constrained by what the ancestors were. And I think this is actually good news. This makes it possible for us to look at living creatures and reconstruct that sequence, and also gives us a kind of a window in a potential taxonomy of the different, at least neuroanatomical pieces into which the brain can be functionally subdivided. So the point is, perhaps we can find, instead of defining of putative systems or inheriting them from our intellectual ancestors, things like cognition, attention, etc., based on ideas about the human mind, we can consider how mechanisms were differentiated and elaborated over evolutionary time long before humans existed. So I've called this approach phylogenetic refinement. It's really nothing more than applying the comparative method in biology to neuroscience, theoretical neuroscience. What you do is you infer a sequence of innovations using the comparative method, looking at different animals, and then to understand some structure at a particular point in time, always ask two questions. What was it before it became that thing? So what was the ancestral state? And how did whatever happened expand behavioral capacity? And always doing this following a chronological sequence, because each stage sets the stage for the next one. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to essentially go through the evolutionary history leading up to humans. I'm going to do it very quick. So here's a phylogenetic tree of different species expanded on the lineage that produced humans. You could do this for any species like zebrafish, but I'm going to do it for humans because I'm human. I'm interested in that and our evolution. Now, when you have such a tree, so this essentially shows the estimated time points when we diverge from different groups of animals. Thick bars are where there's fossil data. If you have such a tree, you can make certain observations. Like, for example, all of these animals possess something called the cerebellum, and all these others do not. And that suggests that the cerebellum probably appeared at some point around here. But it didn't just appear out of nowhere. And that motivates us to ask, what was it before it became the cerebellum? And also, how did these elaborations extend behavioral capacity? Why are there about 60,000 species on this branch and about 100 only on this branch? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a brisk walk through evolutionary history. And it's going to be much too fast. And a lot of jargon I'm going to throw at you, some of which might be rather unfamiliar. It was to me. But I just want you to note that it's a continuous story, and it's one of progressive elaboration and specialization of structures. I'm going to start at the origins of life, actually way off to the left, 3.8 billion years ago. And there's a general consensus that life began with autocatalytic sets. So self-sustaining chemical reactions where you have an enzyme that catalyzes the production of another enzyme, catalyzes another, etc., closing a loop. And once you have that, you have a kind of primitive replication and a simple metabolism. Now, when these systems enclose themselves in membranes, now you can distinguish two kinds of metabolic control. One is control within the membrane, where let's say you maintain the concentration of some necessary nutrient through chemical reactions, exploiting the laws of chemistry. And that we would call physiology. But sometimes you can't produce a compound locally. It's out in the world, and you might find yourself in a situation where there isn't enough of that stuff. Well, you can just move yourself. Even random motion is likely to improve your state under the assumption that there's more of this stuff somewhere else. And that's also a kind of metabolic control that extends briefly through the environment, simply by lack of a nutrient motivates movement. And we could call that behavior. So many people have suggested for many years that behavior is really a kind of extension of physiology into the external world. Very, very simple behavior of something like seeking out food or finding, controlling your temperature. Now, given that, it's perhaps not surprising that the first nervous systems evolved as a specialization of the exterior part of the early multicellular animals, the ectoderm. And in these animals, neurons formed a kind of a diffuse net across the cup-shaped body with two specializations: an apical nervous system rich in chemosensory and photosensitive cells, and a blastoporal nervous system around the blastoporal that controlled contraction and produced movement. And these animals moved around the world in something called levee walks, where you make a number of small little movements and every once in a while make a longer movement. So you sort of exploit a local patch and every once in a while make a big movement to explore and land in another patch. Now, Thomas Hills and others have suggested that governing between these two forms of locomotion was actually the original role of dopamine, long before its role in reinforcement learning or other things. Essentially, when dopamine is high, it's signaling that your intake rate is good. You're getting whatever you need at a good rate. But once your dopamine falls, signaling that you're not absorbing at a high rate, then you make this longer movement and you land somewhere And one proposal then is that the apical nervous system that sort of does a state estimation can control the blastoportal to have different patterns of movement that either move it locally or more globally. Now, this organization remains in cnidarians like jellyfish and anemones, etc. In our branch, the body elongated anteroposteriorly, the blastoportal fused into a slit, and the apical and blastoportal nervous systems merged at one end of the body. This is where the head will one day emerge. And this is the organization C protostomes. This is a gigantic tree of life where you have insects, 930 million species of insects, many millions of mollusks, etc., that have this kind of organization. In our branch, the two pterostomes, the body inverted dorsoventrally, and the neural plate here folded into a tube, folding the base, creating the sort of the basic tubular architecture of all chordate nervous systems. So all our nervous systems are essentially a tube composed of these neuromeres, each of which has a kind of a sensory side and a motor side. Now, we can see that when we look at the Amphioxus, which is a cephalochordate that diverged from us about 650 million years ago, and didn't change its lifestyle very much, and is probably a good window into what this early chordate was like. Essentially, to summarize it, kind of like a hypothalamus attached to a spinal cord. So you have the segment that acts very much like a hypothalamus, secreting hormones, etc., and the spinal cord that controls its locomotion with various projections of dopamine, etc. These animals also possess an escape system, which is probably homologous to ours, where you have a single patch of photosensitive cells in the front projecting bilaterally to a structure in the midbrain called the tectum that then projects ipsilaterally downstream. So the idea is if a shadow falls on the animal, it quickly swims away. As a simple visual escape system. Now, I'm going to skip over the tunicates, even though they're quite cool. And I'm going to jump right to early vertebrates. And early vertebrates, Ann Butler and others have suggested that the eye patch here, this photosensitive patch, split into two that migrated to the side of the back. And once you have this, and then if you favor the contralateral projections, now you have directed escape. Because now if a shadow falls on your left eye, let's say, then you will first contract on the right side of the body, thereby turning, and you'll continue turning until you've oriented yourself away. So now you've oriented yourself away. So now you have visually guided escape behavior. This system, this sort of retinotectile system, expanded to confer some topography. So now you have directed escape from particular points in space. And part of it, elaborate projections contralaterally, right? So now you have a kind of a rostral tectile system for escape behavior, and a caudal tectile system for escape behavior. But you also have this system that if now a light falls on the right side, you will turn to the right first and you'll approach. Now you have these two systems, approach and avoidance. And the decision between whether to approach or avoid something can be very simple. It can be made at the level of the tectum, based on something which ethologists would call stimuli, first, key stimuli. So for example, if there's a shadow and it's expanding rapidly, then engage avoidance. Probably that's something that you should run away. Now, this circuit can be seen quite literally in lamprey. This is the work from the Grillner lab. But you'll also find it in zebrafish, and you also find it in mammals, where the tectum is called the superior colliculus. And it has a medial portion that projects ipsilaterally and governs escape actions, primarily sensitive to space above a mouse, which is where threats tend to come from if you're a mouse, and a lateral portion that projects contralaterally and is sensitive to things like food and for approach. So we see this, and we have this in primates as well. This is a very highly constrained system. I want to make a note about this. And I want to describe this idea of pragmatic representations. We're very far from knowledge. This is just simple sensory motor behavior. So if you have an avoidance system, and if you have a threat on the left, you want to go to the right. If you have a threat on the right, you want to go to the left. You want to specify your action based on some spatial information from the world. But if you have multiple threats, this system can actually average. The average solution is a good solution. You will still escape. And so that can work on the avoidance. But the approach system can't do that, right? Because if you have something that you might want to approach over here and something else that you might want to approach over here, you don't want to average. That's going to give you enough. So for this system, you need a different kind of dynamics. Here, you need to have something that creates some kind of a competition between these different actions, right? They kind of, perhaps on the rostral tactile approach map, you want to have competition between cells guiding you in different directions. Now, so that you choose one over the other. Now, notice you could call this attention because you're attending to one and ignoring the other. And the superior colliculus is implicated, of course. You could call this intention because you are making a decision to move to one or the other. You could call it decision, right? The point is, of course, it doesn't matter what you call it. These animals didn't care what we're going to call it millions of years later. They just wanted to get at the food. So the point is that we're building a different model of brain. It's not knowledge acquisition, it's control of interactions to sort of nested feedback control groups instead of serial computations. And the representations are not descriptive. It's like that approach map is not a description of what's out there or a motor plan. It's just a pragmatic thing that turns you in the right direction. And we have a different conceptual taxonomy. It's not these kinds of things. It's something like this. Now we have different aspects of behavior that emerged at different times. And these actually do correspond to the kind of structures we saw at those times, hypothalamus, midbrain, and spinal. And if we think about something like decision-making in this context, it's not really a single thing. Already, at this stage, we've seen three kinds of decision. One is a kind of behavioral state selection, kind of a hypothalamic decision, sort of based on the legacy of that ancient apical nervous system, where you sort of change your behavior based on whether you're well fed or need some rest. You want to exploit locally or explore more globally, sort of dopamine driven. You also have selection between two different action systems. Do you want to approach something versus avoid something? And that can be based on these kinds of simple key stimuli. A competition between two different circuits, one that projects contralaterally, one ipsilaterally. And within one of them, the approach system, you also need to have this kind of spatial selection, winner-take-all competition on a tactile approach map. And this will look a bit like spatial attention or intention or other, but of course, not other attentional phenomena like feature binding. So we're coming up with a different breakdown again. Now I want to talk a little bit about this because here's a lot of action happening in early vertebrates. So one of the things that also happened in early vertebrates, right? So you have this sort of hypothalamus, midbrain, and spinal cord. As part of the hypothalamus bulged out, forming what will actually become the telencephalon. So I didn't realize this, but it turns out that almost every structure I've ever studied is actually a protrusion out of the second segment of the hypothalamus. And this telencephalon now consists of really two kinds of things, two parts. An outer pallium, which receives a lot of sensory information, can estimate the state of the animal, and the subpallium, which projects downstream to select different circuits like approach and avoidance. This part of this will become the basal ganglia. And this also is a recipient of now phasic dopamine signals. So now, instead of dopamine just telling us things are good or things are not so good, it can now provide extra reinforcement at particular punctate moments. What you did right now in that state was extra good. Do it again if you find yourself. So now you have reinforcement learning. This was, of course, very important in these turbulent times. Now, already the pallium can be subdivided into two regions: a ventrolateral portion specialized for dealing with the local environment, things like approaching and ingesting things and learning associative learning of what you might want to eat. Whereas the medial pallium that's specialized for this more long-term kind of behavior, where now you have to sort of navigate around the world. These are very different. They require kind of different types of circuitry. And this part will ultimately become the hippocampus. Now, jawed vertebrates added the cerebellum. And as I mentioned around here, I'm going to actually skip over the cerebellum, even though it's a rather beautiful story based on Montgomery and Bodznik. I just want to summarize that what it confers is the ability to predict your sensory consequences of your actions. This is, again, Montgomery and Bodznik have suggested this on comparative grounds, but many others, of course, have suggested that this is what allowed our ancestors to become better predators, essentially. And sharks, of course, have been doing this for many years. Bony fish expanded some of these structures, particularly the tectum, but also some of the pallium. I'm again going to skip over this because I want to get to more familiar, more modern animals. Getting out on land. And this was a very major transition, of course, in part because the world is very different. You have a much larger visual range out on land than you have in water. You have a wider variety of things you can do, or what Gibson called affordances. You have new demands like thirst. And you have an expansion of the behavioral repertoire. There's many branches of tetrapods, some of which survived. If we look at, for example, their forebrain that's specialized more finely at this, more complex at this point, if we take a slice through it, we look at amphibians. So amphibians, of course, need to stay near water. And they need to find their way back to water. And one of the things that they do is expand this medial pallium for navigation, that they use for navigation using landmarks, which again is very effective on land. Sauropsids, which is the branch that leads to birds and lizards and reptiles, they dominated the diurnal world. So they succeeded in dominating the diurnal world and expanded the tectum as well as the parts of the forebrain that receive input from the tectum, particularly this ventral and lateral subdivisions of the pallium. And many of the sophistication of reptiles and birds is in this region here. This is called the dorsal ventricular ridge, where these sectors expand, and processing the kind of key stimuli that guide their behavior. But there's also visual input, another path of visual input that goes in the medial pallium, and it's this dorsal pallium here, or dorsal cortex in reptiles. And I would suggest that this region allows these animals to detect the affordances in the world. So things like place to hide. Now, this isn't full modeling of the world or object recognition per se. You don't really need sophisticated vision to, let's say, find a place to hide. Like, imagine you're this lizard, and there's this outcropping. Well, the presence of this outcropping will create a certain pattern of visual stimulation. There'll be a kind of a contrast edge above which texture is brighter than below it. And if you move, then the motion above that contrast edge is going to be faster than the motion below. And if that contrast edge lies above the point of visual expansion, well, then maybe it's a place to hide, right? So you can use these very simple heuristics to find a place to hide, even without the kind of full-fledged sort of image-like vision that we possess. So the proposal is that you can discover the affordances in the world through these circuits in the dorsal pallium. Now, in synapses, which are the ancestors of mammals, things turned out rather differently. They lost the battle for diurnal world, and they became nocturnal. And who can blame, of course, because there were giant dinosaurs stomping around. And they, in retreating to the nocturnal world, one of the things that allowed them to do this was endothermy. But they regressed a bit, their visual system. They lost trichromatic vision. And they relied more heavily on olfaction, audition, and somatic sensation. And they expanded this dorsal pallium, which becomes the neocortex. And it has the unusual developmental pattern where it goes inside out, creating these columns that receive thalamic input radially as opposed to tangentially, like in other structures. And so it can expand really easily. And it did, of course. These are some of the mappings. The piriform cortex winds up here. The insular and cortex suborbital regions are this lateral pallium, and the hippocampus is in here. So these are now becoming more familiar. If we look at what this looked like in early mammals, this is based on the work of Kaz and Krupitzer and others. There's this kind of concentric organization, a island of 6-layer neocortex surrounded by insular and orbital perirhinal regions, as well as these cingulate regions like anterior cingulate, mid-cingulate, retrocingulate, etc. Hippocampus is over here. This is just a topologic, like flat map of the forebrain with various projection patterns. Now, one of the things that this system has is much stronger projections downstream. So now it's more than just detecting affordances, but actually able to influence movement downstream to the metrics of those affordances. So now essentially creating what Graziano and others have called action maps, where you have different subregions that guide different kinds of activities. So running around and searching for things, ingesting things within, right next to your snout, etc. The things in between that ethologists call handling, which includes things like digging in the ground or biting or something to break it open. Defensive movements as well. Each of which has a kind of an idiosyncratic map controlling the kinds of effectors that are necessary. Furthermore, this system also has a projection through the basal ganglia that's much stronger than our ancestors. So now we have the basal ganglia not just projecting downstream, but has this sort of recurrent circuit back into the cortex. And the proposal I would make is that this circuit selects which one of these types of activities you want to engage in right now. So let's say you want to dig somewhere, and that activates this sort of four-limb oriented handling system. And that would be a selection between different kinds of behavior. Do you want to be searching for food now? Do you want to be ingesting the thing you have in front of you? You want to search around more locally. And then once that particular map is activated by the basal ganglia, then you have a competition within it between different, let's say, places to sniff or dig. But at the same time, visual information also goes through this more ventral route, collecting key stimuli as before, but using that to evaluate the value of different actions, different classes of actions, as well as different particular places to go. Now, this, of course, is starting to sound very familiar, right? I'm sure many of you are thinking this is a little bit like the dorsal and ventral streams in the Milner and Goodale version, where the dorsal stream over here is more about guiding actions, and the ventral stream is more about object recognition and classification, or selecting between actions. This is also the basis of the affordance competition hypothesis, which I'll come back to in a little bit. Okay, so this is the sort of early mammal brain. Placental mammals introduce things like a proper motor cortex, corpus callosum. We'll skip over some of this, and I'll get right to primates. Now, primates returned to diurnal life, and again rediscovered a reliance on vision. And they expanded dramatically the frontal, temporal, and parietal, so much so that the temporal cortex curled around the insula, creating this classic shape of the primate. But it still has the same kind of topological organization as other mammals and earlier mammals. But it just more sophistication in certain things, like, for example, more action maps for all the different kinds of behaviors, particularly handling type of behaviors that primates are capable of, as well as going beyond mere key stimulus detection to actual visual object recognition and classification. That still is in the service of this sort of valuation process. Now, what we've come to here now is a bit like a primate brain, and we can now use this to try to explain some of that neural data that I mentioned earlier that was otherwise perhaps a bit confusing. Why have two visual systems? Well, one is specifying the various actions that might be available to you right now, and so it's very sensitive to space, whereas the other is using more like stimulus features to classify the thing you're looking at and whether that's something you might want to reach for or go somewhere else. Why are there multiple representations of space, for example, in dorsal system? Well, because each of these action systems requires different kind of thing. Space within reach, space that's far away, space near the mouth, particular object classes. Why are the variables mixed throughout the system? Why are they sensory, motor, and cognitive? Well, if you have a competition between different actions that's guided by sensory information, then you should have all those correlations in cells in this kind of system. And this should be happening, of course, all at once, because in real life, you have to actually do it all at once. And finally, I want to draw your attention to one of these systems, the gaze control system, which becomes really useful for primates, because unlike our ancestors that essentially foraged by running around and sniffing and bumping into things, primates with their large eyes and the sophisticated visual system could forage using gaze. They could look around and they could appraise something from far away and then decide whether, yes, I want to go and leave this tree to go to that tree, or do I want to look somewhere else? So they could essentially forage in a much more, in a safer way using the system. So now, because of that, because all the other system relies so much on what you're orienting to and gazing at, that system starts to take on the kind of thing that is often called attention. I mean, of course, only one type of attention, kind of spatial selective attention. But of course, these regions have been implicated. Anyway, I'm doing okay on time, so I'll continue. Skip. One of the things I wanted to do now, after spending all this time talking about everybody else, I want to talk a little bit about my work. How does this perspective lead to different kinds of questions? And the example I'll give is decision making. So decision making often is studied by asking questions about very abstract decisions, like choosing from a menu in a restaurant, right? And that then the kinds of questions you ask are, you focus on the representations involved in making that kind of decision. How and where does the brain encode value? How does it combine it with things like cost and delay, etc.? What is the neural representation of things like decision confidence? And other related questions. Again, focused very much on explicit knowledge about the thing that's abstract. This perspective leads one to ask different kinds of questions. It's not like these aren't interesting, but these are perhaps more primary. And to think about embodied decisions, the kind of decisions that animals make as they forage around the natural environment, or the kind of decisions that we make when we're playing a sport, things that are really embedded in the world and very much in real time. And so the focus now is on dynamics. How do we make decisions as the world is changing around us? How do we make decisions when we're already moving and acting in the world? And for that, the proposal is that it's essentially organized as this competition, again, between different kinds of actions you can engage in at a given time. And that competition is actually unfolding in these sort of dorsal systems for sensory motor. So this is what we've called the affordance competition hypothesis. So it essentially suggests that for the primate brain shown here, the dorsal visual system is really kind of, and the frontal parietal cortex is really specifying the potential actions that are available in the world around you right now, the affordances that are present around you. So reachable things, obstacles, etc. And because there's multiple actions, there's often multiple sort of regions of cellular activity corresponding to different actions, and therefore they must compete because you can't do them all at once. And then the resolution of that competition is action selection, and it's based on things like signals from other regions like orbitofrontal, prefrontal, basal ganglia. And interestingly, in this kind of framework, attention and decision making are really quite related. They're really kind of two ends of a sensory motor spectrum. Attention is biased selection, biased competition in a sort of a sensory space, and decision making is biased competition in a motor space. And then execution is not playing out a whole pre-planned motor program, but rather it's a feedback control system. So it's a feedback controller both through the environment and the dorsal stream, as well as maybe a predictive feedback to the cerebellum. And importantly, all of this can happen at once. So you can actually be engaged in some action guided by the world while considering other possibilities to which you might want to switch if circumstances require. Now, this makes a number of predictions. But one thing I want to sort of come back to is this idea of two kinds of selection that will happen in this kind of embodied decision. One is selecting what kind of activity you want to engage in. Are you going to be reaching the, let's say, the berries on a particular bush, or you're going to go and walk to another bush? And that's a selection between different systems. It's sort of a reaching system versus, let's say, a locomotion system that's more medium. And we propose that the basal ganglia is doing that kind of high-level selection, invigorating selectively one of these action maps. So, for example, the reaching system, these regions. And then once that's done, there's a kind of within-system selection, like which berry you will pick from that bush. That requires a sort of a topography of reachable space, and it's defined by the visual information of the objects that are within reach and perhaps compete against each other. And this competition, of course, can be biased by all kinds of sources of information, including prefrontal. So the prediction is that there's a biased competition within these action maps that actually implement action selection. And they're continuously biased by the information as it may be changing. And they're selectively invigorated by basal ganglia. And importantly, this can all take place in parallel even during overt activity. So the example I'll give of one experimental line of research that we've done, as we call dynamic decision making. And one task we've used in my lab over the last 10 years or so is the tokens task. And this is a very simple reach decision task where you're supposed to guess which of these two circles will receive the majority of these tokens that start in the center and then jump randomly every 200 milliseconds. And if you choose the one that gets the most tokens, you get a reward, otherwise you don't. But importantly, you don't have to wait until the end. You can take an early guess when you think you know which one is correct. You don't have to wait until all the tokens jump, and then you can save some time because the remaining tokens jump more quickly. Now, in this task, we actually quantify exactly what is the evidence at every moment in time, and we can sort of plot the profile of that evidence in trials with easy trials, let's say, where the tokens are all going in one direction or another. We can look at ambiguous trials where it's kind of closer to 50-50, and most interestingly, this misleading trials where the first few tokens actually jump in the wrong direction and then they turn around. And so that gives us a kind of a profile of evidence in different trials. And we find that we can explain behavior very well if we imagine that the brain combines this kind of information with something we call an urgency signal, which is something that's just pushing it to decide as time has passed. And if you're hasty, you want to have that urgency signal be higher than if you want to be conservative. So by varying this, you can change kind of your speed action tree. I'm not going to go into details of this. There's many studies that we've published on this, both behavioral experiments with humans as well as neural recording. I'm going to show you some of these neural recording studies where we're recording some of these regions like PMD, prefrontal, basal ganglia, et cetera. I'm just going to summarize it all really quickly by looking at the dynamics of the whole system using these neural state analyses, which I think probably many of you have seen. But the basic idea is if you record neurons, you can represent the state of the system at any moment in time as the activity defined in this high dimensional space where each axis is the activity of one neuron. But often you can reduce that through various techniques like principal components analysis into a lower dimensional space that captures the main variance in the data. And when we do that in our task, we get about 80% of the full variance explained with the first 4 components, which are shown here. And they're quite interpretable. So all this activity is aligned. This is neural activity sort of put through this principal components analysis, aligned on movement onset. You can see this first component is kind of like a state transition between deliberation versus commitment and movement. And we estimate commitment time behaviorally to be around here. So that's commitment and movement onset. The second component looks very much like the evidence that we presented a monkey, right? You have easy trials, ambiguous and misleading for choosing the right target or the left target. So it looks very much like the evidence. The third component is the monkey's sort of speed action trade-off, slow, conservative decisions versus fast, hasty decisions. And the last one is kind of elapsing time. So these two together give us this urgency signal that we derive from behavior. So the first principal components, the top 4 components reflect commitment, evidence, and combined urgency. But they're not like separate modules in the brain. They're distributed in that whole circuit where we record it. And I'll show you what this looks like by plotting the activity in this space of these principal components. So I'm going to skip the third one because it's flat. I'm just going to show you the slow block data. I'm going to just do component 1 versus 2 versus 4. And that's shown here. And when we do that, we can look at what are the states of the system during the deliberation process before the monkey has made his decision. And that the state lives within this polygon. Okay, this what we call it's a relatively flat subspace in the full space. We call decision manifold. It's actually a relatively flat surface, and it's extended along this dimension according to evidence, and this according to urgency. So if we now look at how activity unfolds in these different trial types over time, we can look at how the state, which starts here, moves across this surface. So I'm going to show you that in a little animation. And as I show the activity, I'm also going to rotate this so you can see the 3D structure. So here we go. You can see the state is sort of moving across the surface. You can see the switch in the misleading trials. And you can see that at the time of commitment, the state always arrives at one of these two edges, which we can call kind of a state transition, from which it then shoots off into one of two attractors that's essentially now no longer sensitive to how the monkey makes decision. Movement on sits around here, movement on sits there. So the point is that what we see in the system is not so much a message being passed from a decision-making module to a planning module to an execution module, but rather we see a state transition within a unified dynamical system. It's first in this deliberation state, and then it shoots off into these sort of preparatory and movement states. So it's a unified system, but there's some specialization. If we look, for example, at different regions, we see differences in what that manifold looks like. In dorsal premotor cortex, for example, it's very curved, as if it lies on the surface of a sphere. And that's the kind of thing you'd get from a competing system where the competition is relatively shallow. So this is a system where you can have sort of multiple actions coexist relatively gently, competing against each other. Whereas primary motor cortex is remarkably flat. It's almost a perfect plane. And this is something that you would get out of a competition that's much sharper, where if one cell gets stronger, then it just wins the battle completely. If we look at prefrontal cortex, it's mostly extended along this dimension related to evidence. If we look at basal ganglia, the output nuclei, it's mostly extended along this dimension related to urgency. So essentially, the take-home message is that it looks like basal ganglia motivate the actions, or pushing you to the side. Prefrontal cortex is helping provide bias, and then PMD and M1 put it all into motion, both during the deliberation process and during execution. So it's a distributed circuit, right? There's not a decision module passing a message to a motor module, but rather a state transition in a single unified system. And this functional subdivision is now ecological. So all I've described here is essentially this reaching system. So these regions in cortex with the interconnected parts of the basal ganglia, but of course there are these features, these regions here interconnected with other parts of the basal ganglia. They all have their dedicated loops, and these are partially separate for the different kinds of species typical actions that you might make, like reaching, looking, walking around, etc. Just quickly, I'm going to show where we're going with some of this. So one thing that I want to mention is work with Karim, where we've actually replicated a lot of this with magnetocephalography in humans, doing the same task. And we see some of those same principal components in some of the same regions that we saw in the monkeys. We are also looking at activity and learning. When a monkey's first learning this task, and what we find is that the activity is there in those same region on the very first day the monkey gets the task. So we can see that it's not just some weird overtrained monkey. And now we're setting up to do some virtual reality. We're actually going to give the monkeys a more interesting environment, a fully immersive VR environment, so we can actually do something like forage around and go pick berries and such. And if you're interested, contact. Anyway, but many of you might be thinking, okay, well, that's all fine and good for monkeys picking berries, but what about cognition? What about really much more sophisticated behavior? And of course, we're still 50 million years back or so. So of course, a lot has happened, a lot of interesting stuff has happened. And it's possible that the kind of abstract problem solving that Newell and Simon and others have focused on in sort of classical psychological theory are just different. There's something else that evolved. But the possibility that I'm interested in is how could this system that has been expanding for all this time, how could it go further to something more sophisticated? And what one proposal we've sort of worked on with Giovanni Pizzullo is the idea of hierarchical components computation. I'll just summarize this quickly. Suppose you're this monkey, you're sitting in this tree, and you have this berry that's reachable. You have these apples over here that maybe are out of reach. Well, the berry and the apple can engage activity in this sort of ventral stream that tells you what you might get by grabbing these things. And maybe the apple is more tasty than the berry, but it's out of reach. Now, at the same time, the dorsal system is telling you there's a reachable berry, and your reaching system can go and grab it. There's, of course, also a walkable branch. But you can predict that reaching for the berry will yield a certain outcome, and that's a desirable outcome. And that's fine. And therefore, you might choose to say, well, I'm just going to sit here and I'm going to eat this berry. And that's fine, you'll survive. But if you're slightly more sophisticated, And then you should be able to predict that if I walk forward on the branch, then things that are out of reach might become in reach. And if you can predict this sort of expected affordance, this future affordance, then you can link that to this higher, maybe more valuable outcome. And so perhaps the competition then between different types of activity will be won by walking out of the branch. And this is a little bit like one step look ahead in chess, right? It's saying, well, if I do this, then I get something much better. Of course, still very far from advanced cognition, but it's anyway. And then of course language. Well, what about language? Right? Language really seems different, like a transmission of information, something that's really much more in the sort of classical cognitive way. And maybe it is, but there's also a way of looking at language in terms of a control system, right? So I've described physiology as control that happens to be within the body, right? Behavior is control that extends to the environment and exploits the properties of that environment. Well, you can, of course, also exert control to other creatures. So imagine you're a baby and you're helpless and you can't get this thing on your own. But it just so happens that in your niche, there's something called a parent. And the nice thing about parents is that they're very sophisticated and they're willing to do anything for you, anything for you. So you can just make a noise and they'll figure out what it is that you need. And again, the thing about parents that's really nice is they're pretty complex and yet extremely easy to control. And I know this because I have a 10-year-old son. And the point is now, you can get very complex effects without a lot of sophisticated transmission of information. You don't have to tell the parent how to hold the bottle or how to drive to the hospital. They'll figure all that out. You just need to give them a simple cue that helps them to do the thing that you need, right? And because of that, interaction through other creatures is inherently symbolic and very compact. And yet, it's not really fundamentally, and of course, there's a lot of sophistication that gets built up here as the parents teach the child which cues to give them in order to get one complex effect versus another. And this grows with every generation. So of course, it's very complex, but in the end, I think that fundamentally, communication is primarily about persuasion. Like this talk, I'm trying to persuade you of a different model of brain function. It's not fundamentally about coding and decoding of representations, but really about control of interaction. And the evolution of behavior is expansion of that control further into the world and into more abstract domains. It's not so much serial information processing modules, but nested feedback control loops described by dynamic systems. And that the neural representations that you have in these systems are not descriptive in the sense of conferring knowledge and being easily decodable. The activity we see in PMD is related to sensory information, the monkey's speed-axis trade-offs, motor effort. All these things are mixed up. They're not really decodable, but they are pragmatic in the sense that they get the task done. So things like action maps, and key stimuli, et cetera. And the interesting question, I think, is that if you have all this sort of context-dependent, mixed-up representation, how is it that at least in some domains, it does seem to become detached from that context? I can talk to you about food, we can order food in the menu, and yet without actually seeing the food, or maybe not even being hungry. I can recommend the restaurant without being hungry. So somehow we detach these things from context. I think that's an interesting question. Anyway, in the end, it's a different conceptual taxonomy. It's not really these things, but rather something like this. Now, some of these things are still here, but they're just kind of in a different context. And this taxonomy here is kind of like a summary of my talk, but has the advantage of respecting actually evolutionary sequence, where we may have sort of expanded out from one another, and it actually maps pretty well to the brain, even particular subregions of the cerebral cortex, etc. So I think perhaps looking at things this way and try to figure out these kinds of taxonomies might give us a better fit to neural data ultimately. Now, of course, this was much too fast. If you want some of the details, it's in a few papers that you can look up if you're interested. Thanks for your attention.
C'est les questions. Il n'y a pas de questions comme ça parce que c'est très très clair. Parce que les gens ont soif, ils veulent continuer la discussion avec un verre à la main. Ah, Karine.
So, so you ended up with I think an extract from Michael Stipe, REM.
Yeah.
The head is there to move you around. So
He was a Gibsonian, turns out. Michael Stipe was a Gibsonian.
I just can't understand the link between that and your message.
Oh, well, because the brain's not there for knowledge so much as action, ultimately first, right? And knowledge is important to make good actions, but fundamentally, the foundations, Piaget said this, right? Sensory motor control and gradually construct on the behaviors you have, the more sophisticated behaviors that actually start using things like knowledge. And again, this idea of pragmatic versus descriptive, right? When we think about human thinking, we think about very symbolic representations that somehow capture information that can be actually transferred from one brain to the other. But most of the activity in the brain is very context mixed up, etc. And one question is, how do you construct those descriptive knowledge, explicit knowledge from all these implicit sources? But I think it has to be in that direction, right? It wasn't, again, you got to survive first, and then you can contemplate.
So the follow-up to that would be, so it's clear that if you go back in evolution, like you showed us, the role of interaction, the role of like striving for survival is obviously way more important than I guess than it is today. So we've evolved from that to the point where there are things that are important for survival. Interaction remains important for the world. Action-based behavior is super important. There might be moments where I can maybe ingest information or spend time mind wandering, where I'm potentially not, or at least less so interacting with the outside world, not getting the action.
Well, I think the biggest thing that happens in hominins is the social world becomes the world, right? I mean, the environment, of fish, etc., is different than the environment of terrestrial tetrapods. And they're dominated sort of by different concerns. In humans, the social concerns become overwhelming, right? And so this one aspect of behavior, which may have been a pretty small aspect in these sort of primate ancestors, becomes enormous for our lives, right? And so things like controlling others, imagine a primate troop, and control of others has a little bit to do with where each individual sits, right? You try to get the high perch and then you get dominance. And there's certain repercussions of having dominance in the troop that are advantageous, et cetera. And so it's the dealing with, things like the politics of primates that become more important than, or very important, in addition to things like, feeding yourself and finding shelter, right? Those things are still important, but now your life is dominated by some of those other things. And in human culture, of course, it just explodes in complexity again, because so much of our sort of well-being is based on our social interactions. But this theory is not there yet, and in fact, it's difficult to take this theory to humans all the way to human life because we don't have the comparative data. We don't have enough different human-like species. We have primates and they're pretty sophisticated, but not certainly linguistically, not like him. That's a tricky thing. But nevertheless, I still feel like what we have that we share with monkeys, which is dramatic, and when you look at the brains, needs to be understood in what they did, not what we do now. So it's not about the kind of explicit knowledge that we might spend most of our lives doing. I spend a lot of my time at the computer typing, but that's not what my brain is about. Yeah.
Yeah, following on that, and doesn't mean that so much. With the progress of technology in the last 3 years and how the brain evolved also, do you think that understanding this evolution will allow us to predict how the brain evolved with technology?
I don't think so. First of all, I don't think there's any point at which you could predict future evolution. Like at this time, any reasonable person would have said dinosaurs are going to rule the world, right? But meteors fall. So it's really impossible. It's impossible to say even why certain things happen, it's only really possible to say what happened, right? So you can really only look back. You can't really predict forward. Or I mean, you can, but you're right, likely to not get it right, right? Plus, you know, our society has changed. Civilization changed the rules a lot, right? It's not so, it's not survival in the same sense as it used to be, right? So perhaps certain kinds of behavior will get you more offspring than others, but it's not going to be whether you can escape from a tiger or not. I mean, hopefully you're not going to even ever be in that situation. So I think, and I think, yes, technology has changed things, but it's technology 10,000 years ago, I think more. And the social structures perhaps that have changed things more than, you know, computers or whatever. I don't think it's going to have much of an impact on our evolution. Unless we start tinkering with it, which is a whole other situation. So I think in some ways right now, the game is very different for us. I think.
Yeah, you mentioned some attributes then that has been kind of like selected by evolution and that evolves a bit like as a dynamical system. And I was just wondering, could we like mathematically see those attributes as like attractors of a dynamical systems?
You mean the attributes in the actual phylogeny?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I think it'd be a really interesting exercise to sort of talk about, you know, certain dynamical systems are very robust and other ones are not robust. So if you change a parameter, it just doesn't work at all, right? And so it's likely that the ones we have are ones where every step was a robust step, right? And that wasn't, because mutations are happening all the time. The environment is changing, you know, faster now than ever. But the point is that solutions that are not robust are likely not to last. But defining that is tricky. But I think you could perhaps, like talking about things like lateral inhibition networks are very stable. You know, you can make a model with all kinds of different formalisms, will still get the basic behavior in those kinds of lateral inhibition type networks. That's a very sort of common motif, and it's robust in the sense of parameters don't matter so much, right? So that might be a good one. A lot of it though is just that it's hard to change the old system, right? There are structures in our bodies that are just, our retinal receptors are facing the wrong way. It's ridiculous. And the reason for that is actually back here, neural tube formation. It's because the receptors got folded inside the neural tube, and that was it. They were stuck in them. And you couldn't flip them around even when the eyes formed and created a retina, right? That's, I think, the best explanation for why our receptors are facing the wrong way. We got stuck in a trap back when we were microscopic and transparent, and it didn't matter. And now we have hawks and humans with this ridiculous inverted retina, whereas mollusks don't have it. An octopus eye, the things are facing the right way. It's because it never went through that phase, and so never got trapped. And so we've got all kinds of systems in our bodies, and of course neurally as well. We have all kinds of, you know, circuits that probably are not ideal for our current life. But we have them, and we're stuck with them. And what we've done is use them to the best we can. And this is why I think this kind of exercise is useful, because if we just look at modern human life and think about how to solve that in the brain, we're not going to do it the way the brain actually did it, right? Because it went through all these transitions. We have all kinds of stuff that happened because, you know, we gave up on the ecto projection. Yeah, I mean, there's a myriad of these different kinds of constraints, right? And so the pieces themselves were the pieces from which cognition is built were there before cognition existed, right? And so, and yet that's still what's built. Anyway, that's much cool. There's another question now.
So you spoke briefly about language.
Yeah.
And you know, this is what sets us apart from most of these other, well, all of these other species. And you know, if you think about the current developments in artificial intelligence, there's a kind of massive race towards large multimodal systems, where they see that your vision models will improve in visual tasks if you combine them with linguistic models, and vice versa. Language people are starting to use natural images in their language systems because it turns out it makes them better at language. So do you think that language is kind of this thing, the control thing, where it's just useful for communication? Or maybe it's part of a more key feature of our system that has evolved and that makes us who we are now?
Well, I think so. First of all, what I've said about language applies to most animal communication as well, really, right? Monkeys, again, bare their teeth or something, and the other one backs up. It's a persuasion aspect, right? So I'm really talking about the kind of language which we actually doesn't actually set us apart, right? What you're talking about is what we've done with that machinery, right? And yes, we've done impressive stuff with that machine. I'm not an expert on this, so I can't give you a confident answer, but I do suspect that it is again a continuous construction, and it's a continuous construction not so much in evolution as so much as in cultural progression. So again, every child-parent interaction is becoming more sophisticated with every generation, and that in itself is creating more sophisticated domains of interaction to explore. So now it's social status that goes beyond where you sit, but maybe what job you have. I mean, there's a lot of repercussions. But again, I'm not an expert on this. I'm not sure where it goes. One thing I would say, though, is that I don't think anything of this has anything to do with what large language models are doing. I think that's a completely different thing, which happens to look similar to what we do, but it just isn't, right? It's like, you could have an airplane and you could have the recording of the airplane and they'll sound the same, but they're not the same. And in my opinion, what large language models are doing are taking all the semantic content that structures human utterances and learning the patterns that were structured by that semantic content without actually having the semantic content. And that's why it makes silly mistakes. That's why it's very good at creating phrases, but very bad at solving actual logic problems. And people are trying to give it more information, but I don't think they're using the right approach, because I think what's missing is the meaning, okay? I think meaning comes from interaction, right? What you accomplish with the utterance, right? Or with the representation, whatever, with the actions. That's the meaning of our actions, and the meaning of our interactions is in the case of language. And so just listening to the sounds and the patterns in those sounds doesn't actually have it, because the system's never trained them. The system is passively observing the structure that results from the semantics, but it doesn't have access to this. I think you need to have things sort of more in that sort of Brooks tradition, where you need to have the thing actually go out there and bump into stuff and discover its own, rather the symbols have to come after the meaning of the symbols, as opposed to the other way. I don't know if that makes sense, but maybe not. So I don't think, I think they're very impressive, but I don't think just giving it more data is ever going to overcome the fact that you've never given it actual ability to learn semantics, whether you give it pictures or not. But it was another question. Yeah.
Yeah, just wondering, in your lab, did you test your models on different species?
No, we have monkeys and humans, so that's it. And the humans, we don't put electrodes in. But we have looked at, we've done TMS, we've done MEG studies with Karim, we've done some MRI, some EEG with colleagues. So in my lab, we don't actually do that except TMS and behavior. But we do the same tasks. So that's interesting because we can look at whether the behaviors. And one of the things that's intriguing about the study with Karim, and we were just talking about where we're going to send that paper. But anyway, is that the monkey learned this task through months of reinforcement learning, right? Shaping their behavior so they get what the tokens mean and all that kind of stuff, right? It's through reward related, right? Whereas the humans are said, okay, here's the rule, right? And the humans can translate that rule into something about doing the task correctly, right? Whereas the monkey kind of had to arrive at it through reinforcement. And yet, when we look at the brain, it's kind of similar to the extent that we can compare neural spiking data to MEG. It's kind of similar. It's as if the fact that you're making a decision about where you move your hand or which hand you move, it automatically sort of naturally engages the hand region of the somatic sensory system, right? And then again, the idea is that now, okay, so now if you're making a decision that's fundamentally reported with a button press or a hand movement, it engages those regions. And then it's a question of biasing that competition with the right stimulus information. And in this case, the tokens. And the monkey learns how to set that up through reinforcement, the humans explain, and they seem to, again, converge to a similar looking solution. Now, we don't know, of course, in detail exactly whether it's that's how similar it is. But I would love to do rodents. Yes.
I like what your description just gave of like how the monkey could learn.
Yeah.
Give us something that we, as somebody explains it,
Yeah.
as we do it.
Yeah.
That's what you think if the monkey could. Theoretically, you get a monkey with a magic, it's going to speak after the task. Do you understand it? So if you how do you do it? Will it be able to narrate what the task is about? So do you think it actually understood in the sense that you mentioned before, understanding is the key? Or does it have like this series of cues? I do this, then I do this, and then I do this, and then I get my juice. I do this, and I do. But if somebody tells you what were you doing, what is the objective of the task?
Yeah, like can he explain the task to another monkey through gestures or something? Well, I don't know. So one interesting test would be, would it transfer to the legs, let's say? If he's got foot pedals and he has to use the same cue, is it going to be like he's starting from scratch, or he's just going to say, oh, this, yeah, right? He's just going to learn what he knows about the meaning of the tokens and apply it to the feet. My guess is yes. My guess is there's enough abstraction that he's capable of that the rule can be effector independent. I think that's probably true. But we didn't test that. We don't know.
That's still different.
Oh, it is very different from stating. Well, monkeys don't really have a way of, they don't really have a good way of explaining stuff to each other, right? Now, one thing that John Kalaska has done is had monkeys observe other monkeys do tasks. And then the question is, does the monkey get any better at the task by watching another monkey do it? Not sure. The study was abandoned for one reason or another. I'm not sure what the reason was. It may have been the student that lost interest or the monkey that lost interest. But that's an interesting way to ask the question as well, because we do see, for example, when we do these tasks, so when we train a monkey to do a task, if I go and do the task for him, we'll see the activity in the brain, reflecting what he would do, right? In fact, if I make the wrong choice, the monkey's neurons will fire extra big as if they're really trying to get me to go the other way. Well, I don't know. But anyway, you can do action observation, like mirror neuron type phenomenon. You can look at this in that sense, and you could have monkeys observing others. And we've looked at that a little bit. In fact, Giovanni Pizzularo and I worked with Alexander Battaglia-Meyer in Rome, where they had monkeys both do a decision task by themselves versus observing others. And so maybe that's a way to get it, but I think what you'd like to see is whether the monkey can translate the knowledge that he gained sort of in this implicit pragmatic way, and then come up with a description that he can carry over to another animal. I don't know, but there is evidence of monkeys sort of not so much teaching as facilitating observation, like doing things in a way which is easier for another monkey to see. So it's kind of like demonstrating something. It's not so much explaining, but demonstrating. And so there is some evidence of that, at least in apes. So yeah, maybe that's the way. Maybe that's the way to go. Could we have a monkey whose reward is contingent on the other one making the right decision? Will he find a way to transfer knowledge to the other? Tricky experiment. Yeah, it's tough to have one monkey. Once you have two, it's a lot more twice as many.
Thank you very much.